are these people?
Pacifica Radio. Some people know it, some people don't. But it's been a mainly independent parent company that has had some interesting stuff happen to it recently. So we'll get into it. Yeah. This is from Ann Garrison. You might know her from Black Agenda Report. Here she's writing for the Gray Zone. But she's talking about the impending pro-war Democratic Party takeover of Pacifica Radio. And you can see some of their subsidiaries here, notably KPFK. You might have heard Jimmy back on that way back in the day. So as well as WBA and KPFA. It's all West Coast stuff, but they're important as far as they used to get a ton of good voices out there. So she writes, the largest, most historically influential progressive nonprofit radio network in America, Pacifica Radio, faces a takeover attempt by dim party elements. Will Pacifica embrace the pro-war logic it was created to oppose? What do you think? What do you think, Collin? Yay or nay? Yay or nay on the takeover?
Nay.
So I can't imagine the New York Times, flawed as it is in many ways, would be part of some grand conspiracy to implicate Assad. Sonali Kolhatkar, a Syrian, speaks out on Trump's latest bombing on Pacifica Radio's KPFA Northern California, KPFK Los Angeles, and KPFT Houston in April 2018. Okay, so that's where we're starting here, right? So when Pacifica host Sonali Kolhatkar aired an interview with Syrian regime change activist Robin Yassin Kassab, her guest was adamant about one point in particular, that President Trump had not bombed enough in response to unproven allegations of chemical attacks in Syria. What's happening this week, Collin? What's Israel doing right now? According to Yassin Kassab, Trump had likely only struck a few, probably empty, chemical weapon sites. And his refusal to be drawn more fully into the conflict meant that he was effectively guilty of collaborations with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The actual policy in Syria with regard to the West is not regime change, it's appeasement, or perhaps collaboration. There's no evidence that the United States or the West or the Europeans have actually tried to get rid of Assad. So, regime change is what she's calling for here. Kolhatkar agreed, and together, the two spent much of the hour-long interview chastising leftists who objected to the bombing. Sadly, on the left here in the US, and I believe in the UK as well, we're hearing a lot of people saying there's no way Assad had any responsibility for the chemical attack because he had nothing to gain, she complained, although she never made clear how the Syrian government would benefit by inviting US airstrikes. Collin, you smelled that backpack. It definitely smelled like chemical warfare to you, right?
Sure does.
You went to Duma and had some fun there. By not embracing a more aggressive policy in Syria, they agreed Trump had shown his cards to Assad and demonstrated that the Syrian president could get away with using chemical weapons with little resistance from the West. She cited Reuters, the UK intelligence-linked news agency. Reuters just put out a piece in the last couple of days saying Syria attacked triggered Western action, but on the ground, Assad gained. So we're just actively agreeing with Reuters right off the bat. So, under pressure from beleaguered residents and facing Russian threats of further such attacks, the rebel group Jaish al-Islam finally agreed to surrender Duma and leave for the Turkish border. She quoted, seemingly agreeing that the loss of territory by the Saudi-backed jihadist militia represented a disappointment for Syrians. Spooky in the chat saying, paging Aaron Mate. Aaron Mate. So you don't get Aaron, but you get Max. Max will be here. Skeptics of the Western media's intervention-obsessed narrative on Syria deserve our encouragement, not elitist contempt and condescension. My response to fellow Truthdig contributor Sonali Kolhatkar. God, that name is. Can you make it easier for my Western tongue, please? It's difficult. Like they just call you K. Another source frequently cited by Kolhatkar is Bellingcat founder Elliot Higgins. We talked about Bellingcat before here. Who she introduced to her audience in a 21 segment thusly. Okay. In an age of disinformation and misinformation, right off the bat, great start. Where right-wing authoritarians are on the right. She forgot malinformation. are on the rise. An unlikely institution battling such dangerous trends has emerged in the form of an international collection of citizen journalists and computer sleuths. Bellingcat, founded by my guest Elliot Higgins, is the force behind bombshell revelations centered on the Syrian war, Russian political persecutions, and pro-Trump white supremacists in the U.S. So that's where we're starting. In the course of the sympathetic interview, Kohotker goes on the contrast Higgins' establishment-friendly output with the work of jailed WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange, whom she characterizes as kind of rogue information warrior, hell-bent on releasing state secrets. You also write in your book, here she continues with Elliot, you also write in your book about WikiLeaks, which enjoys a lot of support in the left of the United States, and often when we think about it, sort of citizen-led accountability of intelligence agencies and governments. WikiLeaks often comes up. I wonder why. But you say that WikiLeaks was about leaking classified information. That's okay. Which is different from what your organization, what Bellingcat does. Can you expand on that a little bit in terms of the difference between assessing information and making it public versus actual sleuthing, actual investigation, connecting dots through evidence-based research, i.e. controlling the narrative, as opposed to just putting the narrative out. Throughout the interview, Kohotker defers to Higgins on virtually every matter he turns his attention to, despite the fact that Bellingcat is widely considered to be a tool of US, EU, NATO foreign policy and is funded by private and public foundations, including US and UK intelligence contractors that profit from Western interventions. While the group website insists it doesn't take money directly from government, quote unquote, it's received grants from the National Endowment for Democracy. We know about the NED here as well. How do they say the NED was? What they were doing out in the open, what they used to do covertly, the CIA, isn't that the line? From the founder of the NED. It's received grants from the National EDD, U.S. government-funded CIA cutout, known for promoting destabilization, regime change in states targeted by the West. We've covered that particular regime change here. Although Pacifica Radio established its pro-peace bona fides largely by countering efforts to promote imperialist wars and regime change operations when it came to Syria, different considerations seem to be at play. Instead, Kohotker represents a new generation of Pacifica hosts who enthusiastically embrace establishment media narratives. A faction within the Pacifica audience and its elected governance structure put forth Kohotker and another Pacifica host, Ian Masters, as prominent endorsers on their website, New Day Pacifica. If New Day wins the internal elections, listeners are likely to hear a lot more of them at the 5 major metropolitan stations. We got KPFA in North Cal, KPFK LA, KPFT Houston, WBAI, that's in New York, WPFW in DC, in the run-up to 2024 U.S. presidential election. So, paging Mate here, we found him. Progressive radio host Ian Masters. Does anybody know when Assange became essentially a hua for the Russians? That's what we're starting with. We're pretty much calling
Russian
them
scum.
So, Russiagate fan fiction writer James Risen of the Fearless and Adversarial Intercept, that's a great question. So that's who they're talking to, some Intercept buddies, and, you want to hear them say it? Because it's funnier if you hear them say it.
I mean, the details of what they have on his relationship with the Russians are pretty unassailable and pretty extraordinary in the depths of how much he was essentially working for Russian intelligence. So does anybody know when WikiLeaks and Assange changed from being the group that provided us with the information via Chelsea Manning that put him on the map, and I think he was being independently financed, I think, just by all kinds of people around the world. But then at some point or other, I think the Russians moved in. Does anybody know exactly when that happened, when he ceased to be a real independent publisher and then became essentially a whore for the Russians?
That's a great question. I've thought about that myself. I don't know enough about the details.
Move this man!
This guy.
I mean, the details of
no, I don't want to listen to him again. Thank you. Anything to add before we go forward? Because been through a bit,
I mean, tale as old as time. would you, a question, would you call Pacifica Radio independent?
They used to
in
be.
the same way? Well,
they used to be.
It used to be. But I mean, we've said this. It's like, we've seen this in Breaking Points. We've seen this at Democracy Now!, even though we just played the clip. You know, it's the idea of how to make yourself viable, you know, in a stratosphere that wants to control the narrative, but to make a profit out of it. And in this day and age, you can't, it's almost like you can't do both. You can't speak the truth and actually make a living, or at minimum, even making somewhat of a profit. Like, you ultimately feel, the feeling is you have to sell out in some fashion in order to maintain yourself. And I just feel like we talk about this too much.
Yeah.
Especially in independent media, but I think because I think in a lot of ways, one, we're kind of easy to pick off because we don't have the backing of a larger company where we could just say whatever talking point they want us to say.
I'm still waiting on that Captain Crunch money. It hasn't showed up yet, you know?
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you guys in the chat, you guys are smart, and you know, I don't doubt your intelligence, but I also don't doubt what you're seeing and what you're hearing. Yeah, it's just same shit, different different media company, basically, is all I can say. It's yeah, that's all I can say.
Joe, anything?
And yeah, of course, thank you. And I guess if you look at this from a historical perspective, you know, in the late 80s and 90s, going into the early 90s, this wasn't a problem. You had independent radio. You had, to borrow a phrase from Fox, you had fair and balanced coverage. You had independent voices on the left and on the right. What happened in 1996 was the signing of the Telecommunications Act of 1996,
right,
which consolidated over, I think, 50 different news organizations into 6 corporate-controlled media conglomerates.
I don't know who did that. 6, I have no idea who did that bill. Crazy. Who could have done that?
Right, Bill signed that bill into law. That was a Bill Clinton initiative. It wasn't Reagan. It wasn't Bush. It wasn't Bush again. It wasn't Trump that did that. No, it was a Democrat who did that consolidated all of these independent news organizations and consolidated them into a corporate-controlled, profit-driven media propaganda machine. And that's what you have right now. I have to tell a quick story about when I really discovered that the mainstream media in the United States was truly terrible. As many of you all know, I'm a DJ. I, play music wherever. I've been, including the United States, I've been to 50 countries. One of the countries I visited years ago, I played a show in Tunisia, and I want to say it was either 13 or 14 years ago. And it was right around the same time as the Arab Spring movement. It was also right around the same time as Occupy Wall Street in the United States. I remember I played a show. It was in Susa, Tunisia, which is outside of Tunis by about an hour or so. Played the show with me, my dear friend Ziad, and Akram. They're both still in Tunisia now. And when I played there, I went back to the hotel and I started watching the news. And I was watching Al Jazeera, the real, not Al Jazeera English or Al Jazeera America, which is now no longer in existence. I'm talking about Al Jazeera in Doha. I'm watching it. And they're showing Occupy Wall Street protesters being absolutely massacred by New York City police officers. This is a news organization in the Middle East. Now, remember, in the United States, all the major news organizations, their world headquarters is in New York City. The only one that's not in New York City is in Atlanta, Georgia, and that's CNN. And you can get from Atlanta, Georgia to New York City door to door in just under 4 hours. Delta Airlines flight out of Hartsfield-Jackson takes you to Terminal 2 in JFK. You take one of those $16 buses across the water to Penn Station. 1, 2, 3, A, B, or C, trade down the Wall Street. You're there. No problem. And all of the major news organizations in the United States were just showing a couple of arrests, nothing to see here. Everything's okay. Everything's okay. But a news organization in the Middle East was showing everything that was happening with police officers. I turned on my BlackBerry, because you had BlackBerries at the time. You didn't really have smartphones back in those days. And connected to the Wi-Fi, and my Twitter feed was showing just a couple of people being arrested, a couple of protesters, getting, beaten with billy clubs, but nothing too crazy, nothing nearly as violent as what was being shown on Al Jazeera. And I'm watching this on a TV in a hotel room, and it's in Arabic, and I know about 5 words of Arabic, so I'm watching it with English subtitles. And it was in that moment, I was like, oh my God, the mainstream American news organizations are lying to me. They're lying to me right now. Because how could look, NBC and MSNBC is on 30 Rockefeller Plaza. CBS is on 57th Street, West 57th Street. ABC and Fox are right around the corner. Again, CNN is in Atlanta. How are none of them showing everything that's happening? But a news organization in the Middle East is showing everything that's happening to Wall Street protesters. So again, we talk about this latest organization that is essentially selling out to the Defense Department and other military operatives in order to provide a consistent pro-war, pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist narrative. None of this should be shocking to anybody. None of this should be surprising to anybody. And it's, again, like I said before we started this second segment, it's important to support independent journalism. So if you have the financial capability and means to donate to this channel or this show or any other show that is independent, regardless of what your political leanings are, it is important, because regardless of what you might feel about somebody else's political viewpoint, they have a right to an opinion. But what nobody has a right to is their own version of the facts. Nobody has a right to that. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. No one is entitled to their own facts. So again, continue to support independent journalism, especially this show, because, it's my favorite show.
I am once again asking for your financial support.
What? Huh? Anyway, back to the story. So Ian Masters, we talked about that a bit, left KPFK's airways angrily in August 2021, urging his audience to stop supporting the station because he'd been told to stop ranting about Pacifica's internal politics on the air. But his show, Background Briefing with Ian Masters, now airs on KPFA in the early mornings and afternoons, 4 days a week, with Kohotker's show Rising Up taking its place on Fridays. They have KPF days weekday, 3 to 4 p.m. slot sewn up between them. Of Masters' last 25 shows, 15 have been focused on the alleged perfidy of Donald Trump, more often than not as the lead story. He frequently rails against the sins of Republicans and Vladimir Putin, insists that Russiagate was real, advocates for Joe Biden and his son Hunter, defends the U.S. role in U.S.-Russian proxy war in Ukraine, and calls for ever more advanced weapons for Ukraine. According to Pacifica manager who preferred to remain anonymous, New Day Pacifica are aiming at having Pacifica be an adjunct of the Biden re-election campaign by as early as 24 as possible. New Day Pacifica came to prominence in 2021 when it launched a failed referendum which would have radically altered the bylaws for governing Pacifica democratically. This year, the group is endorsing staff and listener candidates in the upcoming elections for the local station boards. Those elected to the local station boards will in turn elect representatives to the Pacifica National Board, which ultimately runs the show. The P&B hires an executive director who hires general managers who hire program directors at each station, but ultimately these elections are about two things: financial strategy and programming. But the decisions made in the fall's election will ultimately echo across the airwaves of 5 major cities. A recent Roots Action Education Fund mailer quotes Kohotker saying, "We are in a battle for the heart and soul of Pacifica, At stake is whether Pacifica represents the highest standards of journalistic integrity or a mix of snake oil, quackery, and fake radicalism. Indeed, voting in local station board elections at Pacifica's 5 metropolitan stations is open to anyone who contributed at least $25 to one of the 5 in the past year. Candidate literature will be mailed and emailed to eligible voters and distributed at community events. Balloting will take place between August 15th and September 20th, with results announced on October 1st. The anti-war, anti-imperialist campaigns resisting the Democratic Party takeover are represented on the website Rescue Pacifica. In a recent statement, Rescue Pacifica evokes the station's long legacy of peace advocacy, explaining that since 1949, KPFA has stood up to Joe McCarthy and Hewitt and opposed the wars in Korea and Vietnam, as well as nuclear armament. This remarkable radio network has survived many perils, but not all, the message continues. It's never, ever been out of danger. The corporations and their government agencies, the CIA, etc., which subvert the media, overthrow democratically elected leaders, and impose dictatorships around the world, are a standing threat to all independent media, including Pacifica. The group noted that there's a precedent for the liberal campaign to capture the stations. During the 1990s, operatives of the Bill Clinton White House took over KPFA Pacifica. They write in reference to Mary Frances Berry, a Clinton appointee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission who served on the Pacifica National Board until she was ousted in early 2000. Her departure came amid accusations that she used her connections to the Justice Department to deploy police against Free Pacifica protesters during a protracted internal dispute. So she called the cops, urging the station's contributors to have their voices heard in the upcoming elections. The statement added, "We need to restore and defend Pacifica's anti-war voice and defend grassroots social justice programs." So, anything on that? Otherwise, that's it. So,
And one more that has to be said, other than what Joe said earlier, support independent media so as to ensure that they're able to speak.
And if you're in these areas and you want to throw $25 to maybe get a vote, now would be the time. So do your thing, people. Whatever. But anyway,